Hello everyone. Today what we're going to talk about is a subsidy, which is a payment given to a buyer or seller, and I'm going to show you how that affects a market looking at a supply and demand diagram. What we're going to talk about first is a subsidy to the buyers. Okay, now in many ways it doesn't matter who you subsidize, at least in graph world. In real life it perhaps may very much matter who you subsidize, but on a graph it's not going to look a whole lot different, and I'm going to maybe talk about that toward the end. But it is going to initially make some changes that are going to affect the demand curve rather than the supply curve. So let us suppose that we have a $200 subsidy that is given to the buyers. That is, that the money is given from the government to the purchasers, in this case of college tuition, say per credit hour or something like that. They're going to get $200 per unit of education that they purchase. What is that going to do? Well, there's kind of two ways and a couple of tricks that I want to explain how this works. What this is going to do is it's going to have the effect of increasing the demand curve by $200. It's going to look like on the graph that you're lifting the demand curve at every point by $200. Now before I go plotting this out and drawing this in, I want to show you a trick that maybe is very helpful for you, and that is that the subsidy amount is measured in a height, right? Meaning that it's an amount of money. We're measuring it from top to bottom. So what you want to do is first draw what we call a subsidy wedge. This is not a technical term, but it's a helpful way of figuring out how the subsidy affects the market and centering you on the graph. So what does that mean? It means you're going to look for a gap between the supply and the demand curve, the original supply and demand curve, on the right-hand side of the original equilibrium, and you're going to find where is there a gap between supply and demand of $200. So if we're looking at the supply and demand curve, we can see that it's at the quantity of 60 that we find a gap between supply and demand. See, we've got approximately $400 here and $600 here. That is our subsidy wedge, okay? So that's the first thing that I would recommend that you do rather than drawing in the demand curve first, because if you draw in the demand curve first and shift the demand curve, so you've got your D2, what it's going to do is maybe confuse you, because now you've got over here maybe you might look or something like that. So you still want to be focused on the intersection of supply and demand, and if you put the subsidy wedge in first, it's going to center you on the graph. Okay, so your new equilibrium point where supply and demand meet are going to be at 60 and 600. So this is my new price and this is my new quantity. So that's quantity 2, and we're going to call this price 2. Now we can talk about what the real price is and how that works in a moment, but this is where the supply and the demand curve, the new demand curve, meet. Okay, so what you might think of is now we've given this $200 to the consumers, in this case the students, and that's increasing, kind of having the effect of increasing their demand for college education. That increase in demand drives the price up. So the college students used to pay $500 a credit hour, now they're going to pay $600. So that might be what you think of as the price of the education. However, since the college students receive $200, in this case from the government, the cost out of pocket for the students is only $400, right? Because they're getting $200 from the government, so their out of pocket cost is only $400, students or the buyers. Okay. However, the sellers of education, in this case the colleges, are going to be receiving that full amount of $600. So the benefits, of course, in this case the money received by the college is going to be what the seller gets, that $600. So the sellers are going to get this full $600. Some textbooks will talk about the buyer's price and the seller's price. I'm not sure that I like that. But if that's helpful for you, you can think of it that way. I like to think of the price as being reflective of where the supply and demand meet, right here. But however, it's kind of a distorted market. So the out-of-pocket cost of the students is $400. The effective benefit or the total amount received, the receipts by the college, is going to be $600. So what we're going to finish by doing is boxing off what we were going to think of as our subsidy box. So this whole area is the area of the subsidy, right? So this is the area that the buyers are going to end up paying in total. That's going to be their total cost. This is going to be the area that the sellers get. This whole area is the subsidy. I'll just write sub. It's this whole box. So how does this? We've got an increase in our equilibrium quantity, an increase in the equilibrium price. So how does this affect the consumer and producer surplus? Well, forget about the original consumer or the new consumer surplus for the moment. Let's just focus on the old consumer surplus first. So the original consumer surplus was areas A and B, and that was all. The original producer surplus was area C and D, right? So this green triangle was producer surplus. The blue triangle was the consumer surplus. So consumer surplus was area A and B, C and D for producer surplus. However, now that we have added the subsidy in place, the consumers are now going to be paying less out of pocket. So they're going to capture these other areas. So I'll just make up some letters here. We've got areas E, F, and G. So the consumer surplus is now going to be not just A and B, but areas A, B, C, and G. So A, B, C, and G. The producer surplus is also going to expand because remember, the producers used to get 500, but now they're going to get 600. So they're very happy as well. So the producers are now going to have not just this area C and D, but they're also going to capture areas B and E. So the total producer surplus is this whole big triangle. It's areas D, C, B, and E. Now the deadweight loss is going to be just a little bit different than last time. Normally it's going to be referring to what we call unrealized gains. In this case, it's going to be purchases, it's area F. It's going to be purchases that are purchased that are valued less than their cost. So I'm going to say that a slightly different way. When a buyer buys this 60th unit of education, the true cost to society may have been, say, $600. So that would be the amount that the student pays plus the subsidy. But the student only values it at $400 or less. So there's a $200 missing evaluation. Why are we buying something where the benefit is less than the cost? Okay, so that is the area of deadweight loss. It is purchases that are purchased that are valued less than their real true cost when you consider the taxpayer cost and the cost to the student. The last thing that we want to cover is the cost of the subsidy to the taxpayers. So once again, the subsidy box is the area of the subsidy. So $200 times 60 units. So the cost of the taxpayers is going to be 200 times 60, which is equal to $12,000. So this is a $12,000 total cost of that subsidy. And that about concludes the subsidy. I want to throw out something a little bit extra here, and that is what would happen if you subsidized the buyer or the sellers rather than the buyers. The only thing that would have changed is that instead of having a new equilibrium price, we'll just maybe erase this real quick and pretend like this never happened. Instead of having an equilibrium price of 400, what you would be doing is you would be shifting the demand curve or the supply curve instead. So imagine that the supply curve shifts downward or to the right by $200, and your new supply curve is here, okay, instead of the demand curve. Now what that would mean is you're at the same quantity, but you're at a new price. The price would go down to 400. Now the market price would go down to 400, but the effective benefit to the sellers and the buyers would be the same. So we would give that money to the college, and then the college would simply reduce its price down to 400. So instead of the government giving the money to the students and then they pay 600, now the money goes to the college and the students only pay 400, but the sellers are still going to be getting 400 plus the 200, and the students are only going to be paying 400 out of pocket. So effectively, it doesn't really make a difference whether you subsidize the buyers or you subsidize the sellers. In the end, the incidence of the subsidy is going to be the same by the amount of reduced cost to the students or the amount of increased revenue or selling price to the college, in this case the supplier. Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about a subsidy. In this case we are going to be subsidizing the sellers rather than the buyers. Simply put, a subsidy is a payment given to a buyer or a seller. You might think of it as the opposite end of a tax. Tax, the government takes away money. With a subsidy, they're giving you money. Let us suppose that in this particular case, you have a subsidy of $3 given to the sellers or the growers of tobacco. In this case, what we would find is the supply curve would be shifting to the right. It acts as an increase in the supply curve. So what that would mean is we would want to drop or increase our supply curve by $3. Now the way that this is going to look in the graph is you're simply going to drop the supply curve in the amount of $3 at every point. And your new supply curve will be looking like it's going down, but it's actually shifting to the right. However, before you do that, I like to recommend that people do this first. You put in place what we might call a subsidy wedge. That is, where is there a gap between the supply and the demand curve in the amount of the subsidy, which in this case is $3. So if we look for that gap and we go right down here and say, okay, not yet, okay, boom. Here is a gap of between $8 and $11. That is the wedge that we are looking for, our subsidy wedge. And what this is going to do is it's going to really help center you on the graph, help you to draw your subsidy box and figure out the incidence and all that we're about to get to. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish shifting my supply curve. So my new supply curve is going to look like this. It's shifted to the right. And my new equilibrium point is going to be here. So I'm going to draw out my new price and my new quantity. So my quantity has increased. My price has decreased to P2. So what is that going to do? Well, the first thing we want to note is that now the cost of, or the price that the buyer of tobacco is going to pay has been reduced. However, the amount of money that the sellers of tobacco is going to get is now $11. Well, because they're going to be getting $8 from the consumer, so we might think of this $8 price as the buyer's cost, but the seller is now going to get $8 plus the $3 from the government, so the sellers are now going to get $11. So the sellers are going to be getting this $11, while the buyers are going to be paying only $8. So what's going to occur here is we're going to have an increase in the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. Now, before we get into that, let's identify this as the area of the subsidy. Okay, so you might think of this whole area as the subsidy. Now, remember, and we might as well do the cost of the subsidy right now. You know, if you're having a $3 subsidy, $3 per unit, and you're now selling 30 units, well, so it's going to be $3 times 3, or I'm sorry, $3 times 30 is going to be equal to $90. Okay, perhaps this is in thousands or something like that, but it's going to be $90. $3 times 30 units, that's the amount of the subsidy, or the cost of the subsidy to taxpayers. Now let's look at how this subsidy is going to affect the consumer and producer surplus, what we call incidence. Now remember that the seller, they used to be getting $10 per unit, but now they're going to be, in the end, receiving 11. They're getting the 8 plus the 3 from the government is 11. So the producer surplus is actually going to increase all the way to the new quantity of 30, and it's going to increase to that new price. So it's going to be this area of the triangle. Okay, it's larger triangle than it was. The consumer surplus is also going to increase because the consumers used to pay 10, but now they're only paying 8. So the consumer surplus has also been enlarged. Okay, so it's now this larger triangle. So let's maybe add some letters on here. Original consumer surplus might have been A and B. So we'll just write A and B over here. Original producer surplus might have been D, or C and D. So here's C and D. And we'll add a couple letters over here. You're going to have E. This whole area will be E. You'll have F. And this little area here will be G. Okay, so I'll maybe put an arrow here. That's G. Okay, so the new consumer surplus is going to be areas A, B, C, and E. So A, B, C, and E. The new producer surplus is going to be area D, C, B, and G. Notice that they're, of course, overlapping. And that's part of the complexity of the subsidies, that you have this overlapping surplus. But you might notice that it simply looks like these overlapping triangles. That makes it a little bit easier. You're kind of looking for this triangle shape. So what's F? Well, F is the area of deadweight loss. That is, it is the area that the cost of the product, meaning the cost including the subsidies, so the $8 plus the $3 that the government pays, the cost actually exceeds the perceived benefit by the buyer. So this last buyer, number 30, might only value the tobacco at $8, but the $8 plus what the government pays, the total cost to society is $11. So that means that the deadweight loss represents transactions that are undertaken where the cost is greater than the benefit or the value of that particular good, in this case tobacco. One more thing I want to touch on very quickly, and that is, how would this change if the buyers were taxed rather than, or I'm sorry, subsidized rather than the sellers? The only thing that would change is, instead of shifting the supply curve to the right, you would shift the demand curve to the right. And so if you shifted the demand curve to the right, your new demand curve, I'll just put this in here real lightly, would give you a new equilibrium quantity of 30, same as it is now, so forget about this first supply curve, and the new price would be 11. Everything else would be the same. The effective benefit, or the incidence, on the buyers and sellers would remain the same. In this case, the benefit, or the incidence, on the buyers is $2. Okay? Meaning that they are getting a $2 decrease in the amount that they are paying for tobacco. The effective benefit for the sellers is $1. Why is that? Well, the sellers used to get $10 total, but now they're getting $11 total, meaning that they have a $1 increase in the amount of money that they're receiving for the production of tobacco. So the incidence, or the effective benefit, is not based on whether you tax or in this case subsidize the buyers or the sellers. It's actually based on the elasticity. And in this case, what we find is the demand curve is more inelastic. It's more inelastic. And in this case, the supply curve is more elastic. Okay, and what that means in this case is that for the tax or the subsidy, they're going to get more benefit for the inelastic curve, meaning that you're going to get more subsidy benefit. And for the elastic curve, or the less price sensitive curve, you are going to get less subsidy benefit, okay, or less of the incidence of the subsidy. So the incidence or the benefit of the subsidy is not based on whether you give it to the buyers or the sellers. It's actually based on the elasticity. In this case, the more inelastic curve, which happens to be the demand curve, they're bearing, or in this case benefiting, from the subsidy more by the $2 reduction in their cost, rather than the more elastic supply curve, which is only getting a $1 increase in their cost. This concludes the subsidy.